I wanted to talk about skin for portraits today. And let's start here with a slide that we looked at a couple of weeks ago, but it's very relevant now. This is a portrait painting of Michelle Obama by the artist Amy Sherald. And what I wanted you guys to look at is, uh, in sort of a topographical sense, here are some areas of flesh that kind of sit back a bit spatially, the neck, the back of the shoulders. And what I wanted to look at is this range of colors that are sampled from these areas. There's some lighter color and some darker color, and collectively they're very low contrast and a bit dark, which helps them sit back spatially. And then we can look at a few areas where spatially the flesh is coming forward a bit more. And if we look at the range of colors sampled from some of these areas, they're a little bit brighter, a little bit more saturated. So this makes these areas spatially pop forward a bit. We're really talking about the color theory ideas, contrast of saturation and contrast of light and dark. If you squint your eyes and look at these two comparatively, you can see this is a little bit darker, this is a little bit lighter, and these are a little bit less saturated, these are a little bit more saturated. And then let's look at a couple of areas where there's even more pop, or one area actually, the nose, which spatially should really pop forward from this sort of middle area and the background areas of the flesh. So when we look at samples just taken from the nose, we can see a wider range of contrast between light and dark compared to the middle flesh areas and compared to the further back flesh areas. So in a topographical sense, we can play with light and dark and saturation in order to get spatial push and pull. Here is another example with artist Jenny Saville, and this is a good example with some lighter skin. And still in that topographical frame of mind, look at this face that sits in the background and the flesh in that face. And I took some samples from around here, lights to darks, and a couple of the neutrals. And if you squint your eyes at it, again, notice how low contrast it is. And they're fairly desaturated, which will help this face sit back spatially. We can look at some middle ground. This would sort of be some of the middle area, and I took some samples from around here. And we can see quite a jump between the previous and these. They're obviously more saturated and a little bit warmer. And if you squint your eyes and compare the previous and this, they're a bit higher contrast too. There's a bigger shift between lights and darks than there are in the previous. So that helps this area be held spatially in the middle ground. And then let's look at flesh areas that are coming out even more at us, spatially in a frontal zone, frontal, mid, back. So I took a few samples, and you can see now a much more extreme shift between the lights and the darks, and this sample group of colors, they're much more saturated and warmer when compared to these other samples. So you can see how the artist was playing with the color theory idea, contrast of saturation, and even contrast of warm and cool. I'm mentioning these examples so that we can come up with a game plan for approaching flesh in our portrait paintings. And I think it's really worthwhile to think about the portrait topographically when we come up with a plan. And you guys have all seen like a topographical map. So what I'm really thinking about it is a different set of colors for the areas of flesh that sit back spatially versus the middle areas spatially. Sorry about that. And these lower points that sit back spatially have lower saturation, sometimes are darker in value and lower contrast. And a different set of colors for the areas of flesh that come forward towards us spatially. So these will be higher saturation, higher value, and higher contrast. So having said that, it's kind of really helpful to have 3 mixtures ready to go when working on our flesh colors. One for the foreground flesh, one for the middle ground flesh, and one for the sort of sitting towards the background flesh. So then we take a good look at our portrait, and we try to make sense of which areas are going to sit back spatially. So like this would sort of be some of the area of flesh that's going to sit back spatially, as well as some over here. And the neck. So those are going to be one set of colors, lower contrast, lower saturation, a little bit darker maybe. And some middle areas for me, I'm thinking about a lot of these areas of the flesh are sort of sitting in the middle zone. Maybe even a little bit more of this. And these little spots. And those are going to be sort of in the middle range in terms of contrast, saturation, and lightness or darkness. And then we have the areas of flesh that are really sort of coming out at us a little bit more spatially. So this is typically the nose, of course, and you know, maybe little details of the lip, and maybe sort of the bridge of the cheeks. And okay, so this gives me a good game plan. I'm going to mix 3 sets of colors like we talked about. And the last thing I want to kind of consider is, are there areas of the portrait that I want to leave alone? That I kind of like the way that it looks, and I like the underpainting, and I don't really want to cover it up. So I find that there are a few areas like this. Some of this kind of feels right to me. I like it. Some of this cheek area, the beard over on this side, I really don't mind that. I actually don't mind the ear. Um, and so I'm definitely not going to touch these areas much. Um, and if I do touch them, very cautiously, to kind of let the underpainting show through. Some of this is even working okay. And I don't mind some of these areas around the eye either. So I might do a very minimal touch with that. So having all of those in mind, it's time to start mixing. One more brief reflection before we move on to mixing. Take a good look at your portrait, and what you may have noticed is that the previous layers of oil dried completely and became much more transparent than on the day that we were painting it. And this is one of the characteristics of oil. It tends to dry slightly more transparent than when we first worked into it with paint. So even some of these areas, when I was working on it, there was a... So even some of these areas, when I was first working on it, it was sort of more of an opaque, pinky white. So even some of these areas, when I was first working on them, were sort of pinkish white and were quite opaque. And they kind of turned into a soft, translucent glaze. And a lot of these previous layers where we had our glazing of yellow, red, and blue, you can see they're kind of maybe less saturated and showing more of the luminous ground below. So let's mix some paint for our portrait. And as I said, ultimately we want sort of 3 sets of flesh mixture. And one of those is going to be lower contrast, one is going to be the middle ground, which will be a little bit more contrasty, a little bit warmer, and one is going to be for frontal spatial areas of the flesh, which will be higher contrast, higher saturation, and you'll see that in a minute. But I'm starting out by mixing sort of a baseline flesh color. For light-skinned, the palette is mainly going to be 3 colors: titanium white, yellow ochre, and cadmium red hue. So that's what I'm mixing here. If I were mixing for dark skin, it would mainly be variations of 4 colors: yellow ochre, burnt umber, burnt sienna, and cadmium yellow. Regardless of whether I'm mixing for a light skin palette or a dark skin palette or somewhere in between, I'm mixing my baseline flesh colors, and what I'm trying to get is one that's sort of a natural um, skin hue, one that's a little bit warmer and brighter, but also a fairly natural skin hue. And then I'm mixing a third one, which is more neutral and a little bit darker. This is going to be the foundation for the 3 sets of flesh colors that we mix. So I just wanted to also mention that for this more neutral flesh tone, I'm adding a little bit of an emerald green color. And if I were mixing a dark skin palette, in order to get the more neutral skin hue, I might mix in ultramarine blue or even some dioxazine purple. So I divided my baseline flesh colors into 3 separate groups. One is going to be the neutral darker hues, and that's for the areas of flesh that fall back spatially. One in the middle is going to stay the same, and one on the left is going to be brighter and a little bit more contrasty. So I'm mixing my neutrals, and what I did was mix together some black and burnt sienna. And that was so I could go a little bit darker, a little bit more neutral, but still have it be a little bit warmer than just plain black would be. So you see how those 3 are sort of low contrast and a little bit darker, so they'll sit back spatially. And then I'm going to move over to the left column, and I'm just mixing in some white to brighten these up. And if we remember the color theory idea, contrast of light and dark, you can imagine how these are going to work spatially. The lightest ones will come forward towards us. The middle ones will stay in the middle ground, and the darker, low contrast ones will fall back spatially. And I'm just adding a little bit of lemon yellow to boost the saturation. And I'm adding a little bit of green in order to increase the contrast between the hues. Here's a sampling of hues from the 3 separate mixture columns. And I wanted to mention that I'm using bristle brushes, some small bristle brushes in Neo Megilp for the portrait. And Neo Megilp sort of gives the paint some body, and it dries translucently. So it's a good glazing medium, but it's also a good painting medium for some thicker applications. So as we talked about, I'm starting with the darker, lower contrast group of hues and working on areas of the flesh that topographically sit back a little bit spatially. So those outer edges of the face and forehead and the neck. And then I transition into the baseline flesh hues. So that was our original group. And I deal with the areas that sit in the middle ground spatially of the flesh. So the cheeks, the main part of the forehead, a little bit around the eyes, and other parts of the neck. And then around this time, I'm left with the parts of the flesh that sit forward spatially. Um, the brow of the forehead, some parts of the cheek, and the nose. So I'm going to be using my lighter, more contrasty mixtures in order to make these areas sit forward spatially. Notice also how I'm taking a lot of time to refine the area around the nose and sort of leave it higher contrast than a lot of the surrounding flesh. If we think about that idea of atmospheric perspective that we learned weeks back, objects in the distance are lower contrast, objects in near space are higher contrast. And I'm kind of using it like that. I want the nose to be a bit more gestural, let the brushstrokes show, and let there be some uh, fluctuation between light and dark if I can. So at this point, the lips are a little bit flat. So I'm kind of taking a similar approach. I mixed some flesh colors that are a little bit warmer, and some of these warmer flesh colors are a little bit more neutral for the areas of the lips that fall back spatially, like the crack of the lips. The areas that pop forward spatially, I want them to be a little bit warmer and brighter, and that'll help create a roundness to the form of the lips. So now we have a rough topographical portrait blocked in, and some of you are going to like this technique a lot. Now, it's okay to leave areas of flesh rough, but a fan brush is made for blending. So if we want to, we can take a clean fan brush and kind of smooth out certain areas of the flesh. And the important part is to keep the fan brush clean and be really careful about where you are dragging paint. But generally, you want a really soft touch, and you just sort of graze the surface of the paint and move the paintbrush back and forth ever so slightly, and that blends out these contrasty, brush strokey areas of the painting. So after some smoothing, I'm coming back in with a few brush strokes to touch up areas, and then I'll spread it out again and soften it with the fan brush. So the portrait isn't completely done at this phase, but it's getting better, and we've done a pretty good job of working on the spatial push and pull of the skin. So for this week, if you're working on your portrait with oils, this will be a good stopping point. Next week, we're going to pick up with working on some more details and refinements of the portrait painting. Thank you guys, and good luck with the painting this week. We'll work on refinement next week.